I want to thank General Stewart for his kind invitation to address this symposium, and I'm grateful to do so as the General Sir Francis Hassett Chair at the Australian War College. Now, for those of you who don't know General Hassett, he was the first Chief of the Defence Force Staff, the precursor to the modern CDF, and a World War II veteran. He was Adjutant of the 2nd 3rd Battalion at Bardia and Tobruk in 1940, Brigade Major of the 18th Brigade in the Syrian campaign in 1941, and by 1942, when he returned to Australia to fight in the Pacific War, he was made a Lieutenant Colonel at the ripe old age of 23. By 1945, he was the Chief of Staff of the 3rd Australian Division fighting in Bougainville. So my chair's namesake knows a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today, which is the Army, the nation, and the Pacific War. In his speech, the Chief of Army spoke about the importance of oratory. And while I hope to deliver something insightful and interesting, I'm not Pericles, Lincoln, or Churchill. And with only 30 minutes, I can give you some vignettes on my particular topic that I hope are enlightening. So I want to start with the consideration of the Army's engagement with society and the nation through a couple of statistics and the concept of mass. As the Chief said, nearly 1 million Australians served in uniform during the war in a population of about 7 million. A further 500,000 served in infrastructure and war industry. Gross Army enlistments across the country was equal to some 10.28% of the population during the war, and if we break that down by gender and by military serving age, you can see it narrows even more and the pop size grows. The average digger by war's end was between 21 and 24 years of age, between 5'7" or 5'8" tall, and weighing a mere 147 pounds. Now, for the young people in the audience, I'll translate. That's 170 to 172 centimetres and 66 kilos. Although I know I was 6'2" and only 65 kilos when I joined the Army in 1993. But there was not just average Australians in the Army. The Army in the Pacific War included a broad range of Australians. 36,000 women served in the 3 different branches of the Army services, and it also included a Torres Strait Islander Infantry Battalion and Pioneer Company, which along with a few other key units included 766 Torres Strait Islanders. In 1941, the Northern Territory Special Reconnaissance Unit, an Indigenous Specialist Unit, was formed, as was the Australian Observer Unit in 1942. Despite being denied citizenship and restricted in their contribution to the war, by September 1945, some 6,000 Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders were serving. Many more serving with other units without declaring their heritage, including my mother's stepfather, who served with the 2nd 1st Pioneer Battalion from 1939 to 1945. It's also important, I think, to reflect, oops, I've gone a bit ahead too far, on that enlistment slide, if I can go back one. The Navy's enlistments were simply 5.4% of Army enlistments, and the Air Force 29% of Army enlistments. The raw numbers thus tell us the World War II experience for the Australian citizens who joined up was overwhelmingly an Army experience. And just as significant is the data for the Army in terms of those who served inside Australia, with those with direct day-to-day contact with civil population. So the uniform experience for the population was not only larger within the Army service, so was the lived experience of those in the community who engaged with the Army. This is friends and relatives, people they engage with on the streets and in and around the broader community. It's also worth noting some of the statistical impacts on this in terms of casualties. Total Army casualties were 8.46%, but 15.52% for those who served beyond mainland Australia. The Air Force's battle casualties were 6.51%, and the Navy's battle casualties 6.94%. It's interesting to correlate the World War I to the World War II experience. World War I casualty rate for the Army is 64.13%. In World War II, as I said, 15.52%. But the other important statistic of the Second World War experience is that of the POWs. Some 20,746 Australians, equal to the number of wounded in action across the entire Second World War, became prisoners of war. And I'll come back to POWs later. It's also worth noting the equality of sacrifice of the other services, and I want to particularly highlight the RAAF here. Those who served in Bomber Command in Second World War had a casualty rate of 41.37%, 6% killed in action. It's important to note that there is a contrast between the Army and the nation's experience in what is, I call, sort of two halves of this war. The 1939 to 41 experience, and later the Pacific War from December 7, 1941 onwards. The first period was about far-off distant campaigns fought as a part of a global balance of power, imperial defence, and a belief that the British military power in the Mediterranean, by reinforcing completing that campaign quickly, would help to reinforce the balance of power in Asia and deter Japan from war. This was in many ways a limited war effort, and Prime Minister Robert Menzies coined the phrase business as usual in 1939 to describe how the country would continue on. And there were few tangible signs of the war on the home front until 1942. At the start of the war, the Army was also overwhelmingly a militia force. There was no regular army to send overseas. The full-time members were just 3,000, mostly coastal artillery with some fortress engineers, and members of the administrative and instructional branch commanded by a handful of Duntroon graduates. On the 23rd of August 1939, the government called up 14,000 militia for 32 days training, and a week later declared that 10,000 militia soldiers would be called up to guard vulnerable points. Thus, vital asset protection and homeland security was a key feature of reserve soldiers then as it is today. The decision to raise a second Australian Imperial Force for service overseas, and in particular in Europe and the Mediterranean, was carefully managed, given the threat from Japan. The notion of a second AIF, raised with the 6th Division, the first 5 being militia divisions, and the abbreviation of 2nd, e.g. 2nd Infantry Battalion, and the carrying over of unit traditions and colours connected the Second World War to the original ANZACs. This was essential, not just for the Army's identity, but also its broader connection to the nation. As the official historian of World War I, Charles Bean, noted, Gallipoli in the first AIF was where, quote, the consciousness of Australian nationhood was born. The Army of the Second World War was to inherit this tradition, but also bear the burden of its legacy. With no real regular army, the second AIF, like its predecessor, was to be mainly recruited from the civilian population. The legend of the digger had both civilian and military aspects. Thus, the nation was the army and the army was the nation. Such a mobilised civilian military was, as David Rapport has noted, built on mutually dependent variables. The sociologist Sol Ensel, in his study of Australian militarism in the 60s, noted, and I quote, the political function of an army is the key to its character. Both character and function depend on the prevailing conceptions about the place of the army in civil society. This means that the army is partly within everyday culture, which is being carried over into a brief interlude of military life, and partly in accepting myths about the qualities of the Australian soldier, which are general notions about national character transferred to warlike settings. The ANZAC legend placed the army in World War II firmly at the centre of nationhood, embedded by concepts such as mateship, loyalty, courage, self-sacrifice, irreverence towards authority, I'll get back to that, and service to the nation in times of peril. It was a heavy burden for the 2nd IAF and especially the 6th Division in their first battles at Bardia and Tobruk in 1940 to carry, and later for the young conscripted militia soldiers when they went into battle in the Pacific to live up to. As young boys, they had grown up in the interwar years on a diet of ANZAC imagery, and they were led by senior officers who had all seen service in that war. In the interwar years, as Craig Stockings has noted, and I quote, the ANZAC legend grew into an inescapable social force tied to the core of national identity, and its powerful symbolism and mythology permeated all aspects of life between the wars. It was reproduced in schools, championed by veterans associations claiming to represent the body of men at the heart of the legend, and reaffirmed on the 25th of April each year at shrines in every Australian town and city. As the commander of the 6th Division, Major General Ivan McKay noted, quote, the men who comprised the 6th Division at Bardia were largely the sons or the relatives of Australians who had fought in Europe in World War I. They had heard the stories of battle of earlier days and in consequence have developed their own unique, considerable military traditions. So the creation of the AIF also split the army in two. One force designed for overseas service and the militia designed for home service. One an all-volunteer force, the one a conscripted one. By 1941, the Army had raised the 6th, 7th, 8th and 9th AIF divisions, and in 1942, an AIF armoured division. Initially, enlistment in this all-volunteer force was slow, driven by the phony war period and the ongoing question of whether or not the 6th Division would even actually be sent overseas, given the risk of the war with Japan. Most importantly, the AIF were paid at lower rates than the militia for the first 12 months of the war. AIF recruitment was also initially confused by the government announcement of compulsory service at the same time they called for volunteers. And by 1940, the Army was defending ports in Darwin, Newcastle, Sydney, Fremantle and Port Kembla, with some 250,000 men being raised for home defence, 70,000 of them in the active militia, 20,000 in the active reserve, and 40,000 AIF troops under training. The militia remained largely part-time until the Pacific War. Now, the Pacific War, as the Chief said, posed the most serious test ever faced by the Army and the Australian people. Australia was soon lifted to a total war footing with the mobilisation of the military forces and the broader nation coming into effect. Australia would emerge from the war as the most mobilised nation in the Western Coalition on a per capita basis. The rapid advances of the Japanese, the collapse of the Commonwealth forces in Singapore brought war to Australia's shores. The Pacific War saw Australia become a nation at arms, characterised by the ability to mobilise a large portion of its population at short notice, and by an emphasis on a citizen army rather than a professional one. Mobilisation and the total war effort also drove some dramatic changes to the Australian way of life. But this was not necessarily self-evident even just before the war started. General Sir Thomas Blamey, the commander of the AIF, had been recalled from North Africa in 1941. And with war with Japan imminent, he was made Commander-in-Chief of the Australian Military Forces. And he delivered a radio address to the nation on the 15th of November, just a little over 3 weeks before Pearl Harbor. He was despondent about the nation's preparedness for war to come. And he noted in his radio address, and I quote, "And to come from the war in North Africa and its scenes back to Australia gives one the most extraordinary feeling of helplessness. You are here in this country like a lot of gazelles grazing in a den on the edge of the jungle, while the beasts of prey are working up towards you apparently unseen and unnoticed. And it is the law of the jungle that they will spring upon you mercilessly." 1942 was to awaken the nation out of this slumber and to prove to be a pivotal year, not, as Professor David Horner argues, because of the string of major events or battles that year that took place, but how it fundamentally changed our nation as a consequence. The first was mass mobilisation. When Japan attacked in December 41, most of Australia's full-time soldiers were serving overseas. The Army in Australia consisted primarily of the part-time militia, and even when the ships of the Navy returned to Australian waters, which they had before the war started, largely speaking, they were relatively few in number, and the Air Force at home was extremely weak with its effective forces already deployed overseas. By February 1942, Singapore had fallen, and almost 15,000 Australians became prisoners of war. The brigade in Java was captured and sent to Changi prison camp, and Australian battalions at Rabaul, Timor and Ambon, along with independent companies in New Caledonia, were captured. Prime Minister Curtin noted, and I quote, "The fall of Singapore opens the battle for Australia." For the first time, Australian defence planners were faced with the real prospect of Japanese invasion. On the 19th of February, Japanese aircraft bombed Darwin. Prime Minister Curtin insisted that the AIF troops return to Australia instead of going to Burma as Churchill and Roosevelt wanted. In doing so, the Australian government reaffirmed the principle that Australia was part of an allied coalition. Ultimately, it was for the Australian government to decide where its troops would fight. This was the most explicit statement of Australia's strategic independence, and it was a decision over the fate of the Army, the symbol not only of Australian military power, but also, in Curtin's words, the defence of the nation. On the 15th of March, the Japanese agreed to capture Port Moresby and the Southern Solomons to isolate Australia by seizing Fiji, Samoa and New Caledonia. Japan's main aim was to prevent Australia from becoming a base for Allied counter-offensive. The security of Australia would therefore depend upon the battle for Port Moresby, and if it were captured, the Japanese could strike at will on the north coast of Queensland. Hence, the Papuan Campaign of 1942 became a decisive chapter in Australian military history, the ANZAC legend and the defence of the nation. Curtin also turned Australia to America. In March 1942, General Douglas MacArthur took command of the combined Australian, US and Dutch forces in the newly formed Southwest Pacific area. The crisis of 1942 had a deep and long-lasting effect upon our nation. It was an all-in war effort. The military fought pivotal battles at Coral Sea, Kokoda, Milne Bay, Guadalcanal and Buna, the Battle of El Alamein in Egypt in October to November 1942, and the Bomber Command raids of that year. Darwin and the North were bombed. Japanese midget submarines entered Sydney Harbour. Japanese submarines shelled Sydney and Newcastle. Curtin passed the Statute of Westminster in this Parliament, or the Parliament down the road, backdating it to September 1939 to the start of the war. This established the legislative equality for the self-governing dominions of the Empire and was a major step to Australia's full independence. And in May of 1942, the government forced through a war measure that made the Commonwealth the sole collector of income tax, a temporary measure for the duration of the war only that we have been paying ever since. The war forced rapid industrialisation of the economy that continued after the war. Australia's wartime gross domestic product peaked in real terms in 1943 at 41% above its immediate pre-war figure in 1939. Food production by 1945 became capable of feeding 14 million people, that is double the Australian population. But population was key, and Australia realised it needed a larger population for its armed forces and to build a more substantive industrial base. So immediately after the war, the Churchill government launched a massive migration program, and the First Minister of Immigration, Arthur Corwall, promoted it with the slogan of "Populate or Perish." The post-war migration program completely transformed Australian society in the second half of the 20th century. The experiences of the front line and the home front were brought together as much as possible. On the 19th of August, at the height of the Papuan campaign, Curtin gave a speech where he noted that there was no real distinction between the battlefront and the home front. Soldiers were living rough, he said, and doing it tough. People at home would not face the same dangers, but they could make do with a similar way of living. If soldiers were downing bully beef and only having the occasional beer, then the rest of Australia, Curtin said, could live like that too. I reflect on the interesting notion of making my family and friends eat ration-packed ham and egg and disintegrated army chocolate as a part of their weekly diet. Neither the AIF nor especially the militia were well equipped at the start of the war, a product of underinvestment in equipment and capability before the war and the massive expansion during it. This drove a concept of necessity in moulding the Army's traditions and its engagement with civilian life. Limited resources, sparse population, incapacity to defend the country unaided, reliance on citizen forces all contributed to this aspect of the military tradition. This defined Australia and its army as different to those countries who possess large, standing, well-equipped forces. A lack of material resources led to a greater emphasis on the bravery and resourcefulness of the individual soldier or the small independent unit, a factor refined by the character of war in the Pacific, which was largely conducted by small unit actions, the work of patrols, platoons, companies and battalions and brigades, rather than the panzer or tank corps armies and army groups of the European theatre. With a lack of equipment and constant fighting for resources, scrounging therefore became a major virtue of the Australian Army, sometimes reaching embarrassing proportions. Australian soldiers bartered liquor or dubious souvenirs from their American colleagues, including cigarettes, clothing and small items of military equipment. During the Papua campaign, it was proverbial. This lack of resources, in particular levels of artillery, armour and logistics to support the Army, much of which was often provided by Australia's allies, meant the Army's focus was largely tactical and often socially driven. The Australian tradition in military history attests this, while the majority of military history, broadly around the globe, is mainly about strategy, campaigns, large battles, and with personalities' attainments and the failings of commanders, Bean's World War I history and Gavin Long's World War II history are largely war history focused on units and individuals. They are histories from below. Histories written from the regimental point of view rather than those from general headquarters. The restoration of a focus on military strategy in military history in Australia to deal with operations strategy and in the Second World War is largely a phenomenon in Australian military history pioneered by the soldier scholar and Vietnam veteran Professor David Horner from the 1980s onwards, and largely delivered by the Army History Unit in their campaign series. And it's left a legacy for which David has trained generations of military historians and mentored them, myself included. Now, the citizen nature of the World War II Army in the Pacific, especially the large-scale use of the militia in combat, and the traditions of ANZAC and the AIF also led to an interesting engagement with notions of rank. The Commander-in-Chief of the AIF and later AMF Pacific War, General Sir Thomas Blamey, remains a controversial figure. While an excellent administrator and a competent and capable strategist, and arguably the only Australian commander to operate at both the strategic and operational levels of war, he is more notoriously known for his speech in September 1942, when under extreme pressure during the Kokoda campaign, he told soldiers that they behaved like rabbits by withdrawing up the Kokoda track. And I quote, "It's the rabbit who runs who gets shot," Blamey said. His reputation amongst the soldiers was poor. His ability to engage with them on their level completely limited. But in essence, this was not something that troubled Blamey at all, because he saw his job as an organiser, a strategist and a commander. And in that military realm, and at his level of command, being loved by the troops, he believed, was far less important than giving frank and direct advice to government and managing his senior officer appointments. Nevertheless, larrikinism was still a factor in the World War II Army, but less emphasised in the Pacific War than it had in the earlier Middle East War. But in Australia, the suspicion of rank seemed to rest less on hostility to the idea of hierarchy, as it was such a feeling that the men who attained command were rarely worthy of the exercise of it. A recurrent myth about the Australian Army concedes what Laffan describes as, quote, the unwritten creed amongst officers that they would never ask a man to do anything they themselves could not or would not do. For the rank and file and junior officers, General Blamey, for instance, fell far, far short of this creed. While General Stewart spoke earlier of the importance of national conversations in oration, theatre and stage, another important element is the literature of war. Now, I commend to you a number of outstanding memoirs or novels on the Pacific War. John Hepworth's The Long Green Shore remains a favourite. Russell Crowe holds the film rights and I'm still yet waiting for him to make the movie. But also Osmar White's Green Armour, Peter Ryan's Fear Drive My Feet, Pina Penny's Singleton Johnson's Secret War are all worth reading. But I want to briefly talk about one of the great novels / memoirs of the Army in the Pacific, T.A.G. Hungerford's The Ridge and the River, an epic tale of jungle warfare that vividly conveys the nature of the citizen soldier and of small unit actions, where the jungle is as much the enemy as the Japanese. Is one of the most fascinating reflections also on the discussion of rank in the Army in the Second World War. The hero, Corporal Alex Sherwood, the leader of a patrol in the jungles of Bougainville, has several times refused a commission. When his superior, Major Lovett, asks him why he will not go to officer school, Sherwood replies that he cannot face the thought of ordering good men to get killed. He dreads the responsibility of standing up from the ruck, it says, as a commission rank is an implacable Rubicon from which he will not cross. It's a fascinating reflection on the mask and responsibilities of command. Looking at Lovett, from whom he esteems, the author says, Sherwood felt sure that he hated his loneliness and he hated the necessity for making his men resent him. At the climax of the book, Lovett tells Sherwood that he's been given a commission in the field without the need for an officer's training course, and this Sherwood finally at last accepts, because he feels in this way that he's thoroughly earned his rank from his soldiers, not being given his rank from a school. But the broader themes of the book resonate with the way in which the ANZAC Legion evolved during this war. The survival of humanity in wartime is a deep, sad subject of the Ridge and the River. Indicative by the in the end by stoicism rather than heroism. Its mayship is never mawkish, its disenchanted soldier humour never forced, nor is its motion debased on sentimentality, Rick Hoskin wrote. Hungerford chose to limit the scope of his work, taking what must have been reasonably experiences of jungle warfare and concentrating on character types not normally found in war fiction, but ordinarily complicated human beings. In other words, Hungerford chose to depict the digger of legend and myth. But I take issue with his last sentence of that. I would argue that the notion of the citizen soldier in the nation in arms in both wars does in fact mean that Hungerford was capturing was the digger legend, because its very foundational form, the ANZAC tradition, reflects the values of our nation. That the army in both wars, and especially the Pacific War, given its mass as a percentage of the population, the existential threat to the nation and mass mobilisation, that was, as I said, the army was the nation and the nation was the army. The survival of humanity in wartime in the ridge and the river and its focus on stoicism over heroism is also core to how the ANZAC legend evolved during the war. Stoicism and survivability became the core of the ANZAC experience, exemplified by the endurance and stoicism of the digger in the jungle, but also the prisoner of war experience. The POW experience in World War II is multifaceted. It's a story of tragedy, survival, endurance, and the human spirit on an epic scale. It is also one of profound suffering and loss. The post-war POW experience was seen as a Pacific War addition to the ANZAC legend. This is often because no single event in the vast expansive nature of the Second World War held the public imagination like Gallipoli or the Western Front. And by the latter part of the Pacific War, Australia was not fighting in the decisive battles of the war like it had been in 1918. POWs also represent some 20% of all deaths in the war. But it was not just the sheer scale that cemented the experience in the Australian memory, it was the circumstances in which they died. The Thai-Burma Railway, for instance, accounts for 35% of the deaths of POWs. It was both notorious for the suffering, but also, as Joan Beaumont noted, quote, for the sheer megalomania of the conception of the project by the Japanese. Post-war, there was a fury of publishing activity in the decade after the war's end, particularly by survivors of captivity under the Japanese. The most prominent of these books were Rowan Revette's Behind Bamboo, Russell Braddon's The Naked Island, and Betty Jeffries' White Coolies. Equally powerful was fiction. A Town Like Alice was made into a film in 1956, a TV series in 1981, and a BBC radio series in 1997. But more recently, this has been kept alive in popular culture through Richard Flanagan's book, A Narrow Road to the Deep North, which won the Booker Prize in 2014, was made into a Netflix series in 2025 to universal acclaim by its reviewers. In these literary accounts and memoirs that followed, ex-prisoners of war alluded the humiliation and sense of degradation inherent in captivity, and implicitly and sometimes explicitly emphasised the qualities of prisoners that accorded with the dominant national archetype of an Australian fighting soldier. In other words, they claimed that although they were defeated and passive, in captivity they proved themselves worthy of the ANZAC tradition by manifesting the qualities of resourcefulness, humour, and above all, mateship. Stephen Smith, who you might know, then Defence Minister and later one of the independent reviewers of the DSR, noted on ANZAC Day in 2013 at Hellfire Pass that the traditions forged at Gallipoli and later by the POWs who suffered and sacrificed on the Thai-Burma Railway have become an indelible part of our history. They are thus part of the Army's and the nation's memory of war. So since war's end, the contribution of the Army in the latter part of the war has been overlooked. Australia's military operations in the Pacific War, apart from the Kokoda track, have and largely continue to live in what historian Peter Stanley has once described as a green hole. That is, they are as mysterious and unknown as the jungle that surrounded them. They were, however, the most extensive and most complicated operations the Army has ever undertaken. And even in the last month of the war, the Australian Army had an army group in the field of over 6 divisions, 3 IAF and 3 Militia, all of whom were in contact with the enemy. At war's end, the Army demobilised, and out of the remnants emerged the first proper, regular, professional army in Australia's history as we faced the trials of Korea and the early Cold War. Currently, the new defence policy in Australia has once again faced the nation against the risk of major war in our region. And for the first time in over 60 years, we're planning for potential mobilisation of the civilian population once again. So I want to end where I began, with Sol Ensel's notation that the political function of an army is the key to its character, and both the character and function depend on the prevailing conceptions about the place of the army in our society. If mobilised civilian armies like those of the Second World War were, as David Rapport noted, mutually dependent variables, it's time for us to consider what mutually dependent variables we have between the army and our community today as our strategic circumstances rapidly change. Thank you.